Unauthorized use may result in legal liability. My name is Jonathan Kingsley, but everyone calls me John. I once served in elite units, carrying out missions that newspapers don't write about, making decisions on which people's lives depended. Now, I'm a successful businessman, owner of several companies, and a man who should not be crossed. I am accustomed to calculating situations 10 steps ahead, seeing the lies in people's eyes before they even speak them. But I did not notice how lies had settled right in my own home. My wife, Catherine, or simply Kate, has always been a woman who knows how to charm. Tall, statuesque, with impeccable style, she was used to being the center of attention, catching admiring glances from men and envious ones from women. We had been married for over 17 years, and all these years I had turned a blind eye to her flirtations with business partners and lawyers. I thought it was just her nature, and I gave her freedom because I knew that real predators don't fuss over small things. But now, looking at her, I saw not just a woman enjoying attention. I saw a person who didn't care anymore that she had a husband and a son. Our son, Oliver, had always been a smart boy. At 16, he had inherited my insightful mind and some coldness in his character. He rarely opened up to anyone, preferring to analyze people rather than trust them. That's why his words sounded like a warning signal to me. I came home late, a usual day full of meetings, contracts, numbers. But when I opened the door, I immediately felt something was off. The house was too quiet. I knew this sound, or rather its absence. It's the sound of a place where something bad has happened. Oliver usually heard me when I arrived. He would come out of his room to at least briefly say hello. But not today. I headed to the hallway and was about to call him when the door to his room suddenly opened. Oliver stood on the threshold, pale, his lips pressed into a thin line, rage in his eyes that he was trying to suppress. What happened? I asked, looking intently at him. Where were you? He asked sharply instead of answering. It's not easy to throw me off balance, but there was something unusual in his voice. Not just a teenager's irritation. No, there was fear, anger, and contempt. At a meeting. Why do you ask? Oliver clenched his fists. I called you. I quickly pulled out my phone. Missed calls. 3 of them. Damn. Sorry, I was in negotiations. Didn't hear. Of course you didn't hear. His voice was quiet, but it rang with steel. But she heard. And do you know what she did? I slowly raised my head. Who? Catherine. Your wife. My mother. He took a deep breath and stepped toward me, looking me straight in the eyes. I called her when some unknown guy started breaking into our door. My heart froze for a second. What? Some bastard big, in a suit, tried to break the door. I was in my room when I heard someone outside shouting. He was asking about Mom. Said she promised him something, but now isn't picking up the phone. Did you call security? I called you. He clenched his fists. But you didn't answer. It felt like a punch to the chest. Okay. And your mother? Oliver smirked, but there was no joy in that sound. She said she couldn't talk right now. I slowly lifted my gaze. What do you mean, couldn't? I got through to her on the 3rd try. She picked up and said, Ollie, don't distract me. I'm in an important meeting. He clenched his teeth. I told her someone was breaking into the house. And do you know what she answered? I couldn't look away from my son. Handle it yourself. I'm busy. A cold anger boiled inside me. And what did you do? Oliver smirked. I took your Glock. What? It was in the safe, but you taught me how to open it in case of an emergency. I took the gun, approached the door, and said that if he didn't leave in 3 seconds, I would shoot. And he left. How'd something like that bitch will pay for this? But he left. I felt an icy whirl rising inside. I didn't know what angered me more, that someone threatened my son or that his own mother abandoned him at that moment. You did well, I said quietly. I know, he replied defiantly. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Don't take the weapon without my permission again. Then don't leave me alone with this crap, he replied quietly. I clenched my fingers into a fist. Catherine, what could be more important than her own son? I was going to find out. I sat in my office, pondering what had happened. Oliver's words still echoed in my head. Who was this man? Why did Kate not even consider intervening? But most importantly, how many similar incidents had I missed? A couple of hours later, when the silence of the house became almost tangible, I heard Oliver enter the office. He didn't knock, as always, just opened the door and walked in, holding a bottle of soda. You look like you're about to explode, he observed, sitting down in the chair opposite me. Do I? I looked up at him. And you look like you figured it all out a long time ago. He smirked, but there was no mirth in it. I just stopped turning a blind eye to it earlier than you did. I leaned back and crossed my arms over my chest. Then tell me, what exactly am I missing? Oliver paused for a moment, examining the contents of his bottle, then slowly raised his eyes to mine. If you want, let's check, he suggested. How often does she stay late at work? I frowned. You mean to say that work is a convenient excuse? Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. He took a sip of his soda and continued. She always says she has important meetings, that it's not up for discussion. Now think about how often she prioritizes our desires and requests. Something unpleasant clicked inside me. Let me guess. You've already checked? Oliver nodded. Her work ends earlier than she says. She always stays late on the same days. Coincidence? Maybe. But you taught me to analyze. I leaned forward, looking intently at him. Son, why didn't you tell me anything? He shrugged. Because you didn't want to see it yourself. I clenched my fists. He was right. I really didn't want to see it. I wanted to believe that my marriage was more than just a convenient partnership. But Oliver, he had seen what I had chosen to ignore long ago. All right, I said quietly. Do you want us to check on her? I want you to see it all yourself. No guesses. No theories. Just the facts. I nodded, feeling an icy resolve rising within me. Then let's begin. Organizing this party was more important to her than anything in recent years. Kate demanded perfection, an elite restaurant, live music, designer decorations, an exclusive menu from a Michelin-starred chef. She didn't just want a party, she wanted a statement. And as always, her desires had to be fulfilled. I saw how she literally floated on waves of anticipation, choosing her outfit with such care as if she were getting married. At one point, I even smirked and said, Kate, you're preparing as if it's not a birthday, but a wedding. She laughed, flirtatiously adjusting her perfectly styled hair. Well, I just want this day to be special. I didn't take her words seriously. I was too busy making her happy. At her request, I rented one of the most expensive halls in the city, ordered handcrafted decorations from Italy, invited the best musicians, ensured exclusive dishes and drinks, and even arranged for fireworks at the end of the evening. John, this is amazing, the restaurant manager told me when I came to check on the preparations. Your wife will definitely be thrilled. I hope so, I replied, scanning the room. Everything was perfect. I didn't count the money. I didn't mind. If she wanted a celebration, she would get it. But the closer the day came, the stronger a strange sense of anxiety grew. Kate was too lively, too excited. She behaved as if she was expecting something more than just an evening among friends. That night, on the eve of the celebration, I watched as she lay down to sleep next to me for the last time. She turned off the light and rolled over, barely noticing me. I pulled her close and lightly kissed her temple. Tomorrow's your day, I said. Yes, tomorrow. Her voice sounded strangely. I didn't think much of it. I didn't yet know that it was the last time I would kiss her. The evening was perfect. At first glance, one might think that Kate had achieved her goal, to throw the party of her dreams. Guests in expensive suits and designer dresses, a hall decorated in gold and silver tones, exquisite appetizers, music filling the air with light euphoria. Waiters with smiles carried glasses of champagne, and security guards at the entrance checked the invitees as if it were not just a birthday, but a grand ball for the elite. I entered the hall without fuss or noise, as always. I didn't need to announce myself. I was already the most important person in this building, though Kate did not suspect it. She stood in the center of the hall, shining in her new dress, long, red, tightly fitting her figure. Her hair perfectly styled. On her lips, that same smile I had once fallen in love with. But now there was something foreign in that smile. When Kate noticed me, her eyes flashed with irritation for a moment, but she quickly put her mask of joy back on. Oh dear, you're finally here, she said with a light condescending tone, stepping toward me. I hope you've managed everything. I smiled slightly. Well, the money certainly went where it needed to go. She smiled, but something flickered in her gaze. You're so reliable, always getting the job done. I noticed a waiter nearby about to lead me to the main table, the very one where Kate's family and closest friend sat. But before he could speak, Kate gestured for him to stop. "Seat him." She paused for a moment as if pondering, then carelessly waved her hand somewhere far away. He has already done his part, paid for the party. The waiter froze. So did I. For a moment, silence reigned in the hall, and then someone chuckled softly. The laughter was picked up, and soon mocking smiles, whispering, even outright laughter echoed around the tables. Kate didn't even glance at me. She just returned to her guests as if she had said something trivial, as if I wasn't even there. I didn't move, just watched her. Then, silently, I turned and walked through the hall to the furthest table in the corner, where the dim light of the lamps made the space almost invisible. I sat down, crossed one leg over the other, and slowly sipped my whiskey, and watched how Kate shone in the center of attention, laughed, flirted with the guests, ran her hand over the shoulder of some slick lawyer standing next to her, and how no one, absolutely no one, came up to me, as if I no longer existed. The music played louder, wine flowed like a river, conversations became more animated. The atmosphere heated up, guests relaxed, allowing themselves excesses, and then the glasses chimed. Someone started tapping on a crystal glass with a spoon. First one, then another. In the center of the hall, Kate stood up from her seat and slowly surveyed everyone gathered. A thrilled smile touched her lips. "Dear friends," she paused, holding her breath, savoring the anticipation of the moment. "Today is not just my birthday." I raised my glass and looked at her with cold curiosity. "Today, I want to announce something special." A perfect silence fell. All eyes were fixed on her, including mine. I took another slow sip of whiskey, not taking my eyes off her. And I already knew something truly interesting was about to happen. Kate reveled in this moment. Her voice sounded light, confident, as if she had rehearsed this speech several times in front of a mirror. Today is a special day. Her lips touched by that same signature smile that had once charmed me. Only now, there was not a drop of sincerity in it. A day when I want to thank all of you. She swept the room with a radiant gaze. For your support, for your friendship, for being here with me in this important moment. The crowd at the tables buzzed happily. Someone raised a glass. Smiles grew even wider. And I just sat in my corner, watching this theater of the absurd. But most importantly, Kate paused, clearly drawing out the pleasure. I want to thank one special person. I looked at her, slowly turning the whiskey glass in my fingers. A person who has been by my side for many years, who helped me achieve what I have, who provided for me, supported me, and invested in my future. I slightly raised an eyebrow. Could she actually have had the decency to thank me? But then she turned not to me. "Dear friends, I want to introduce you to the man of my dreams." The hall buzzed. Whispers swept through the guests. I felt Oliver, sitting in the far corner, tense up sharply. My entire body froze for a second, but my face remained impassive. From behind the tables emerged a tall man in an expensive suit, with a Hollywood smile and meticulously styled hair. Richard Sloane, lawyer, a self-satisfied bastard who loved pomp and loud declarations. He approached Kate, and she extended her hand to him, like a queen. This man has become what I've dreamed of all my life. He smiled theatrically, knelt on one knee. "Catherine," his voice sounded like honeyed velvet. "You're the most wonderful thing that has happened in my life. And tonight, on this special evening, I want to ask." The hall held its breath. "Will you marry me?" Applause, laughter, excited exclamations. Kate, pretending to be surprised and moved, covered her mouth with her hand, then solemnly said yes. They kissed. The crowd erupted in jubilation. Glasses were raised. Waiters scurried about, serving even more champagne. I just watched. Kate sharply turned to me. Her eyes burned with triumph. She held a theatrical pause, then loudly said, "John, you were an investor in my life." Someone in the hall giggled. But love cannot be bought. Now everyone laughed openly, looking at me mockingly. I have found a worthy man. Everything inside me stopped. I shifted my gaze to Oliver. His hands were clenched into fists, lips pressed together, face ashen. I slowly inhaled and stood up. Leisurely, I adjusted the cuff of my shirt, then my watch, and began to clap. The only one in the entire hall. Loud, clear. Well, look at that. My voice, full of icy sarcasm, cut through the noise, and the hall began to quiet down. I took a step forward, now not taking my eyes off Kate. You mean to say? I nodded towards the decorated hall. You had the audacity to organize this party with my money, gather all these people, wine and dine them with expensive wine, adorn yourself with jewels bought on my accounts. Kate paled, but held her composure. I stepped even closer, now with a cold smirk, and announced that you now have a new husband. Silence fell over the hall. I tilted my head, as if I was actually contemplating her actions. Then I slightly shook my head, chuckled, and added, So, and just trash that can be thrown out, am I? The waiters froze. Guests exchanged glances. Someone coughed awkwardly. I looked at Richard, who was holding Kate by the waist, but his confidence was beginning to crack. Chicken. I turned to Kate with a light surprise. Have you lost your mind completely? She opened her mouth, but I didn't give her a chance to speak. Or did you, before staging this circus, go to confession to God and ask, what should I do to fully experience hell on earth? The hall was still dead silent. Only now, it was not a silence of surprise. It was a silence of fear. Kate finally tried to open her mouth, but I was no longer listening to her. The phone rang precisely at 9 in the morning. I was just sitting on the terrace, sipping coffee and watching Oliver tinker with his laptop. He had noticeably cheered up in the last few days, no longer looking as though he was carrying a mountain of unspoken anger. The call was familiar. I didn't answer right away. I let the phone ring about 5 times, knowing that the person on the other end was sinking deeper in a panicked despair with each second. Finally, I lazily pressed the answer button and said nothing. John. Kate's hysterical voice came through the phone. God, finally. I don't know what's happening. I remained silent. My accounts. Her voice trembled, and it was strangely pleasant. They're all frozen. Everything's gone, John. She was crying. I took another sip of coffee. Damn it, John. Now her voice broke into a scream. You have to help me. I closed my eyes. Doi. She faltered. I misspoke. But please, you can do something, right? I heard her nervously swallow air, try to control her hysteria. John, I understand you're angry, but I'm in a terrible situation. I took a deep breath, barely suppressing a smirk. Kate. She instantly fell silent, as if expecting a tiny glimmer of hope. I spoke slowly, clearly. You wanted to get rid of me. With those words, all her former confidence in her voice collapsed in an instant. Well, Kate. I paused briefly. How does it feel to live without my support? A sob came through on the other end. She tried to say something, but now hopelessly. Her voice trembled. John, I calmly disconnected the call. The phone went silent. I looked up and met Oliver's eyes. He had heard everything. For a few seconds, he just looked at me, as if absorbing the moment. Then he nodded quietly, with satisfaction. I smiled, and returned to my coffee. Oliver remained silent for a while, as if digesting the conversation he had just heard. Then, finally, he put aside his laptop and slowly shook his head. Dad, his voice sounded thoughtful. You react so strangely to this. I raised an eyebrow. In what sense? He smirked, but his smile contained more surprise than mirth. You don't even look surprised. Did you expect this blow? I took another sip of coffee, enjoying the silence around us. Expect it? I repeated, shrugging. Oliver, I knew about the affair several months before this circus. My son froze. What? I smiled, leaning back in my chair. Do you think your mother would have been so reckless if she didn't feel completely safe? She thought I didn't notice, that I was so blind and busy with my affairs that I wouldn't even suspect what was happening behind my back. Oliver was silent, studying me intently. I nodded towards his laptop. If you want, you can check. All her bank accounts are empty now. He frowned, typed something on the keyboard, and, after a few seconds, muttered under his breath. Damn. I leaned back calmly. I bought her debts long before she even realized she was in trouble. Oliver looked up from the screen. Wait, did you set this up yourself? I nodded slightly, enjoying the shock in his eyes. Let's just say, I took precautions. I paused, giving him time to process, and then added, and Richard is in deep shit now, too. Oliver blinked. How so? It's simple. That fool thought he was clever. Thought he could run off with someone else's wife and live off her money. But he didn't account for the fact that the money wasn't hers, it was mine. My son was looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. I continued slowly. I didn't just cut off their funds. I set him up so that now he owes money to people you generally don't want to owe. Oliver exhaled sharply. You mean he either pays up or disappears? My son was silent, then slowly shook his head. Dad, this isn't just revenge. This is... He paused, searching for the word. I smiled slightly. It's justice. Oliver stared at me for a long time. Then suddenly he smiled. Holy shit. I looked at him over the rim of my cup. Get used to it, son. This is just the beginning. The morning started off calmly. I spent it as I had hundreds of previous days. Coffee, a brief conversation with Oliver before he went off to school, a quick glance at the reports, a couple of calls with partners. Everything followed the usual script. By midday, I was already in my office, a spacious room with panoramic windows and a view of the city. The office smelled of expensive wood, and there was always a buzz of business activity beyond the wall. My employees knew if something made it to my desk, it would be resolved immediately. I reviewed some documents, signed a few papers, and leaned back in my chair, checking my phone. Nothing important. For a while, I just watched the people behind the glass. They hurried, talked, moved with an illusion of control over their lives. I was jolted by a strange feeling, as if something was about to happen. But before I could dwell on it, the phone abruptly vibrated. The number was unfamiliar, but the area code was local. I picked up the phone. Hello. The voice on the other end was uneven, agitated. Mr. Kingsley? It's your neighbor. Damn, I don't know how to say this. I immediately felt a tension in my chest. Go ahead. There's a fire. It didn't sink in immediately. What? Your house. It's on fire. Tom seemed to slow down. I no longer heard what the person on the other end of the line was saying. There was only one question in my mind. Where is Oliver? Do you hear me? The neighbor's voice trembled with panic. The fire department is already there, but your son was inside. I don't remember how I ran out of the office. Don't remember crossing the office, descending in the elevator, or getting into the car. But I remember how I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I remember flooring the gas, oblivious to traffic lights or car horns. I remember only one thought pounding in my head. Not him. When I turned onto our street, my heart slammed against my ribs so hard it darkened my vision. The house was engulfed in flames. Fire burst from the windows. The roof was consumed by smoke. Glass cracked from the heat. Firefighters ran, directing streams of water, but I could see the fire was relentless. I got out of the car slowly, as if moving through a nightmare. Oliver. I exhaled, but my voice was lost in the roar of the fire. I had just taken a step toward the house when someone's hands grabbed my shoulders. Sir, you can't go in there. In front of me was a firefighter, his face covered in soot. My son is in there. I didn't recognize my own voice. We're looking for him, he shouted, struggling to hold me back. Our guys are inside. I saw them making their way through the smoke, another firefighter smashing a window to enter. Seconds stretched out like an eternity. Where was he? I grabbed the man by the collar, his eyes widened. Somewhere on the second floor. We're searching for him. I clenched my teeth so hard that my temples ached. Who? Who did this? Somewhere behind me, I heard a neighbor shouting, someone explaining something to the police. I couldn't hear them. I was only looking at the house. At the second floor, at Oliver's window, flames were bursting out, the glass shattered with a crack, and it felt like something inside me burst along with it. We found him. The voice cut through the roar of the flames like a clap of thunder. Everything happened as if in smeared frames. Red flashing lights. The screech of brakes. Voices merging into chaos. I ran after the stretcher, but the medics pushed me away. Sir, step back. We need to work. Oliver lay unconscious, his skin covered in soot, lips cracked, his chest barely rising under an oxygen mask. I felt his faint breathing even through the noise around. Is he alive? I didn't recognize my own voice. One of the doctors quickly glanced at me. For now. For now. That word struck like a hammer to the chest. The ambulance door slammed shut, and I was about to jump inside, but a firefighter grabbed my shoulder. Mr. Kingsley, I turned around, barely containing my fury. What? The man looked uncertain. He opened his mouth, then closed it, as if unsure whether to speak. Out with it, damn you. His room, he swallowed. The door was locked. I froze. What? We found him behind the bed on the floor. But the door was locked from the outside. The air turned thick and heavy. Are you sure? Absolutely. We had to break it down. My ears buzzed. This was no accident. Someone knew he was there. Someone knew there would be a fire. Someone deliberately locked him in so he couldn't escape. My heart constricted painfully, but within moments it began to beat furiously in my chest. Who? Business rivals? Could they dare such a thing? No, those people are not idiots. They know who they are dealing with. They understand that such actions are not forgiven. But then, I gasped at the realization. Could it be? I felt my muscles tense with fury. That bastard. Richard. Kate's Loa. If it was him, I couldn't even finish the thought because I was overcome. If it was him, had better start counting his last seconds alive. I could no longer control my breathing. My hands clenched into fists until my knuckles cracked. Where is he? My voice was a hoarse growl, filled with the promise of death. The firefighter stepped back, but I was no longer looking at him. I grabbed my phone and dialed a number. Mr. Kingsley, there's an emergency. The voice of my assistant turned into background noise. Find Richard Sloan. Now. And pray that he's still breathing when I find him. An underground club. A dimly lit room saturated with cigarette smoke and the stench of stale alcohol. Dull thuds of bass shook the walls. Dark figures in the corners discussed their dirty deals. Richard had come here with a nervous smile, clearly trying to feign calm. He thought this meeting was his chance to make a deal. But as soon as his gaze fell on the man at the central table, his back stiffened. John Kingsley. He sat perfectly calm, slowly twirling a glass of whiskey in his hands. But his eyes, the eyes of a beast ready to tear apart its prey. Richard froze for a moment, then forced a strained smile. Well, I thought you were ignoring me, John. John didn't move. He just slowly raised his eyes and finally spoke. You don't look so good, Richard. Is the wife costing too much? His voice wasn't loud, but each word sliced through the air like a blade. Richard tried to compose himself. He even managed to smile, trying to exude confidence. You lost, old man. He squared his shoulders, pretending everything was under control. She chose me. Silence. John slowly took a sip of whiskey. Pause. Is that so? He finally replied, setting the glass down on the table. Now show me who you are without money and power. Richard turned pale. John leaned forward slowly, his shadow falling over Kate's lover's face. You know what's most interesting? His voice was as cold as ice. Richard nervously swallowed. You thought you could take what belongs to me and get away with it. He paused, letting Richard feel the weight of those words. But you didn't just steal my wife. He took another sip, slowly swirled the whiskey in his mouth, and added, You touched my son. Richard froze solid. John's eyes sparkled. You brainless worm. Did you set the fire in my house? Richard shook his head, smirking. Well, He leaned forward lazily, resting his elbows on the table. He didn't realize the danger. He didn't see the break in John's eyes. What? Didn't expect that. He tilted his head to the side, grinning like a satisfied jackal. No one has ever done this to you before, huh? John didn't move. Richard continued, his tone becoming even more insolent. First I took your wife. A dull thud. The glass in John's hand shattered into fragments. Now I've taken your home. A drop of blood slowly trailed down his fingers, glass embedded in his skin. Richard smirked. How's your little one, by the way? He leaned in closer, almost whispering. Dead? Silence. John didn't blink. He didn't even flinch. He slowly unclenched his fist, allowing the glass to dig deeper into his skin. Blood dripped onto the table. Richard still didn't realize he had just signed his own death warrant. Blood ran down his fingers. John slowly unclenched his fist, allowing the shards of glass to embed deeper. But he felt no pain. He felt nothing but a growing, cold, all-consuming rage. Time in the club seemed to slow down. The music thumped dully in the distance. Conversations around sounded as if through water. All attention was focused on one person. Richard was still smiling, not understanding he was already dead. What, Kingsley? Nothing to say. He spread his arms, reveling in his pathetic moment of triumph. You were always so important, so invulnerable. And now, everything you had is burned to ashes. John looked up at him. At that moment, Richard finally noticed something had changed. A cold glint passed deep in John's eyes. The silence stretched, becoming agonizingly long. You really want to know how my son is? John spoke slowly, dragging out each word. Richard blinked, his smirk faltering. Yeah, why not? John leaned forward, his bloodied hand quietly landing on the table. He's alive. There was no emotion in his voice, no relief. Just pure, controlled terror. Richard went pale. Well, he nervously ran his hand through his hair. Good for him, damn it. But you know, fires. John slowly, menacingly smiled. Fires happen. He leaned even closer, so much so that Richard could feel the deadly chill emanating from him. Tell me, Richard. His voice was low, but it carried a promise of absolute, inevitable retribution. Have you ever had your skin burned? Richard recoiled sharply. Now he felt it. Felt that he had crossed a line from which there was no return. But it was already too late. Richard paled visibly, his smirk dissolving, giving way to genuine fear. He slowly, almost mechanically, leaned back, tried to increase the distance between himself and John, but the table blocked him from moving further. What? His voice trembled. He stumbled for the first time, losing his confidence. John didn't blink. His eyes remained cold, still dead. I asked. He slowly traced his finger across the table, leaving a bloody trail. Have you ever had your skin burned? Richard swallowed, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes darted around the room, looking for an escape route. John saw this. He reveled in this moment. Richard, this arrogant, self-assured jackal who thought he was the victor, now resembled a cornered animal. But the most interesting part was just beginning. Behind Richard, a door quietly opened. John didn't move, didn't even shift his gaze, but from the expression on Kate's lover's face, he knew they had entered. Richard. The voice behind him was husky, filled with cigarette rasp. Richard jolted, sharply, convulsively, like a rat suddenly cornered. What the? He turned around, but stopped abruptly when he saw who was standing by the door. 3 men. No smiles, no emotions. Faces as cold as stone, eyes dead, sentenced. They hadn't just shown up here by chance. Richard realized. His debt. He thought he cannot pay it back. He thought he had protection, but he was wrong. One of the men took a slow step forward, and Richard abruptly stood up, knocking over a glass. Hey, hey! He threw up his hands, backing away, but the table behind him prevented him from retreating further. Calm down. One of the men said quietly, we're just going to talk. Listen, let's sort this out. Richard's voice broke, and John smiled to himself. Richard wasn't so brave when he no longer felt he was in control. The 2 men moved closer, and now his eyes darted between them and John. John, he spat the name out like a curse. Did you bring them? John slowly took a sip of whiskey, savoring the flavor of the moment. Me? He feigned slight surprise. Oh no. He set the glass on the table and calmly added, they found you on their own. Richard lunged to the side, but one of the men grabbed his shoulder and shoved him back into the chair. Richard cried out, not from pain, from terror. Now he fully realized there was no escape. Listen, he'll pay everything back. His voice choked with panic. He desperately tried to articulate, but his words tangled in ragged sobs. You were supposed to have already. One of the men responded coldly. The other calmly rolled up his sleeves. Now, we'll have to take it. Richard realized this was the end. He squirmed, thrashed in the chair, but his arms were firmly held down, pressed into the armrests. John. His voice cracked into a scream as he turned again to Kingsley. You can't let this happen. John watched calmly. He tilted his head and slowly said, and why not? Richard screamed when the first blow struck his ribs. The crack was dull, but distinct. Richard gasped, his face contorted in pain. Damn. A second hit. Crack. His breath caught, eyes wide open in wild terror. Please. Stop. John. A third blow. This time his scream seemed to make the entire club hold its breath. Richard didn't realize it was only just beginning. I think a couple more, and he'll stop breathing, one of the men commented calmly, wiping his knuckles. John watched, unblinking. Richard thrashed in the chair like a caught fish, his hair sticking to his forehead, his face twisted in a cry of helplessness. John, I didn't mean to. John calmly stood up. He approached him slowly, with the lazy confidence of a predator who has already decided the fate of his prey. You didn't mean to? John leaned in close, so Richard could feel his breath on his skin. You locked my son in a burning house. Richard jerked. You wanted him to burn alive. John's voice was almost gentle, but it carried not a trace of human warmth. And now you're asking me to stop? Richard sobbed, tears streaming down his face. He muttered something frantically, but John wasn't listening anymore. Break more. Richard squealed, and John just watched, allowing each second of torment to engrave itself in his memory. It was just. The phone rang unexpectedly, slicing through the tense silence, filling the room with an ominous premonition. John didn't immediately realize it was his phone ringing. He stood motionless, watching as Richard writhed in the chair, gasping from the pain, trying to gnaw at least a morsel of mercy. The phone rang again. Kingsley slowly looked down, as if surfacing from a dark, viscous abyss, and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with the hospital's number. The club, which had just been filled with the sounds of bones breaking, screams, and quiet, dying pleas, suddenly became eerily quiet. Everyone in the room felt the importance of the call. John swiped the screen and slowly brought the phone to his ear. Kingsley. A quiet voice on the other end rang with emptiness. Mr. Kingsley. Pause. We regret to inform you. Your son, Oliver. A moment that split reality in half. He didn't make it. Silence. A hollow, dead silence. As if at that moment, everything in the world ceased to exist. The air in the room froze. Every person in the club stood still. Voices breathing, even the hum of distant music, all disappeared. People who had seen John in the most dangerous moments, in minutes of his cold-blooded revenge, for the first time felt fear. Because he didn't scream, didn't clench his fists, didn't explode. He just froze. A voice pierced the silence. Richard. He jerked his head up, his face contorted in horror, eyes wide with panic fear. No. The voice broke, trembled, filled with despair. No. It's a lie. He thrashed in the chair, tears streaming down his face not from pain, but from terror. He isn't dead, but John didn't hear him. He slowly put away the phone, his fingers clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. No one dared to move. He looked up. Empty eyes. A black abyss where nothing else existed. As if his heart had died along with Oliver. His gaze slowly swept the room, studying the faces of the people. They looked away. They didn't want to look at them. Because in that gaze, there was no human, just an empty shell, filled with pain and animalistic rage. He slowly turned his head towards Richard. He was trembling, pale as a corpse. Don't do this, he managed to say, his voice hoarse, faltering weak. John didn't respond. He just turned and took a few steps. To the wall, to the dark corner, where on a massive wooden stand hung an axe. The dull thud of metal as John picked it up. The weight. A deadly, merciless weight. Oh God, no. Richard thrashed harder, his body arching in panic, but his arms were still firmly tied, pressed into the armrests. He shook his head, pleading. John, please. Kingsley turned around, stood before him, dropped his empty, black gaze. Leave. Everyone. People exchanged looks. No one dared to object. One by one, silently, not looking in his direction, they left the room. Only two remained. John. Richard screamed as the first blow struck his ribs. The crack was dull but distinct. Richard gasped, his face contorted in pain. Damn. The second blow. Crack. his breath caught, his eyes wide open in wild terror. "Please, stop, John." The third blow, this time his scream, made the entire club seem to hold its breath. Richard didn't realize it was just the beginning. "I think a couple more, and hell stop breathing," one of the men remarked calmly, wiping his knuckles. John watched, unblinking. Richard thrashed in the chair like a caught fish, his hair sticky against his forehead, his face twisted in a plea of helplessness. John, I didn't mean to." John calmly stood up. He approached slowly, with the lazy certainty of a predator who had already sealed the fate of its prey. "You didn't mean to?" John leaned in close so Richard could feel his breath on his skin. "You locked my son in a burning house." Richard jerked. "You wanted him to burn alive." John's voice was almost gentle, but it held not a trace of human warmth. "And now you ask me to stop?" Richard sobbed, tears streaming down his face. He frantically muttered something, but John wasn't listening anymore. "Break more." Richard squealed, and John just watched, allowing each second of agony to etch itself into his memory. It was fair. The phone rang unexpectedly, slicing through the tense silence, filling the room with an ominous sense of impending doom. John didn't immediately realize it was his phone ringing. He stood motionless, watching as Richard writhed in the chair, gasping from the pain, trying to gnaw at least a morsel of mercy. The phone rang again. Kingsley slowly looked down, as if surfacing from a dark, viscous abyss, and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up with the hospital's number. The club, which had been filled just a minute ago with the sounds of bones breaking, screams, and quiet, dying pleas, suddenly became eerily quiet. Everyone in the room felt the significance of the call. John swiped the screen and slowly brought the phone to his ear. "Kingsley." A quiet voice on the other end echoed with hollowness. "Mr. Kingsley." Pause. "We regret to inform you. Your son, Oliver." A moment that split reality in half. He didn't make it. Silence. A hollow, dead silence. As if at that moment, everything in the world ceased to exist. The air in the room froze. Every person in the club stood still. Voices breathing, even the hum of distant music, all disappeared. People who had seen John in the most dangerous moments, in minutes of his cold-blooded revenge, for the first time, felt fear. Because he didn't scream, didn't clench his fists, didn't explode. He just froze. A voice pierced the silence. "Richard." He jerked his head up, his face contorted in horror, eyes wide with panic fear. "No." The voice broke, trembled, filled with despair. "No, it's a lie." He thrashed in the chair, tears streaming down his face not from pain, but from terror. "He isn't dead." But John didn't hear him. He slowly put away the phone, his fingers clenched so tightly that his knuckles whitened. No one dared to move. He looked up. Empty eyes. A black abyss where nothing else existed. As if his heart had died along with Oliver. His gaze slowly swept the room, studying the faces of the people. They looked away. They didn't want him to look at them. Because in that gaze, there was no human. Just an empty shell, filled with pain and animalistic rage. He slowly turned his head towards Richard. He was trembling, pale as a corpse. "Don't do this," he managed to say, his voice hoarse, faltering weak. John didn't respond. He just turned and took a few steps. To the wall, to the dark corner, where on a massive wooden stand hung an axe. The dull thud of metal as John picked it up. The weight. A deadly, merciless weight. "Oh God, no." Richard thrashed harder, his body arching in panic, but his arms were still firmly tied, pressed into the armrests. He shook his head, pleading, "John, please." Kingsley turned around, stood before him, dropped his empty, black gaze. "Leave." Everyone. People exchanged looks. No one dared to object. One by one, silently, not looking in his direction, they left the room. Only two remained, John and Richard, locked in this dead, soundless space. Without witnesses, without salvation. Richard was torn apart by panic, no longer trying to maintain composure, no longer pretending he controlled the situation. He understood that he was about to die. "John." His voice trembled. "Please." John slowly raised the axe. And for the first time in his life, Richard Sloane understood what real fear meant. Richard choked on his own screams, his body arching in a desperate attempt to break free, but the straps on his wrists and chest cut into his skin, holding him in the chair. He gasped for air. His eyes looked as if they were about to pop out of their sockets. "John." His voice was hoarse, torn by fear. You can't just—" John didn't answer. He just stood over him, holding the axe down along his leg. The handle was warm, the metal cool, and the weight in his hands felt natural. He looked at Richard with no trace of emotion. Just emptiness. Just pain that demanded release. "You killed my son." His voice was quiet, almost lifeless. But these words twisted Richard all up. He shook his head, gasping in panic. No, it was him. It wasn't me. It was just a coincidence. Crunch. John abruptly planted the axe into the table, right between Richard's legs, and he squealed so loudly that the walls shook. John, no. John didn't move, just watched as before him trembled a filthy, pathetic creature he once didn't even consider a threat. "Tell me the truth, Richard." Richard sobbed, his head jerked left, then right, his fingers clenched in convulsive spasms. "I didn't mean to." John gripped the axe tighter. "But you did." Richard coughed in fear, his lips trembled, and tears rolled down his face, but John was unmoved. He had seen too many similar scenes, but never before had he felt such darkness inside himself. "You want to take everything from me." Richard trembled even more. "John, you're a smart man." I was." John slowly raised the axe, now holding it with both hands. "But today—" Richard froze, his mouth open in a silent scream. "Today I'm just a father with nothing left to lose." Swing. And Richard's first scream even drowned out the music in the next room. The door swung open heavily, creaking as if it itself feared letting anyone else inside. The first to enter stopped at the threshold, their breathing off, their gaze fixed on what remained in the room. Amid the quiet, fear-saturated air was a barely perceptible smell of blood, warm, fresh, thick. In the center of the room, settled in the chair like a broken doll, sat Richard, once a slick, self-assured bastard, now just an empty shell, saturated with the terror of his final moments. His head limply hung to the side, his jaw slightly open in a frozen scream, his eyes, which had recently splashed with fear, now empty and dead. His hands were still tied to the chair, but now they no longer twitched in convulsive attempts to free themselves. The axe lay nearby, a silent, crimson-soaked witness to retribution. But the most horrifying sight was not the dead Richard. It was John Kingsley. He sat opposite, on the edge of the table, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he was listening to something. But he didn't move. He just sat. His shoulders trembled, but not from fear, not from fatigue, from pain, from something unbearable that no one around could see. Silence hung in the air like a curse. And then, very quietly, almost imperceptibly, rays of sunlight broke through the dark, dusty room. It seemed like nothing special, just a normal sunrise, a normal new day, which doesn't give a damn about pain, death, or suffering. But at that moment, it was not just the sun. It was something else. The rays touched the floor, as if slicing through the dense darkness of the room. And at that moment, a dove flew into the open window, right into the center of the hall. It landed quietly, without fear, on the wooden table opposite John. It didn't flinch at the sounds, didn't fly away from the smell of death. It just watched, straight into the face of a man who had lost everything. It seemed John didn't notice it at first, but after a few seconds, he slowly raised his head. His lips quivered, his eyes empty, bottomless. And then suddenly he smiled. Not as one smiles from joy, not as one smirks before vengeance. It was the smile of a madman who had just heard something that no one else could understand. Understood. He said it so quietly that the people in the room didn't immediately realize he had spoken out loud. But he clearly heard something. Was it Oliver himself? Maybe. He told him it was time? John abruptly stood up. Car keys. His voice was calm, but it sounded even more terrifying because of it. People in the room exchanged looks, unsure of what to do. One of them, with trembling hands, reached into his pocket, pulled out the keys, and cautiously extended them. John took them, not looking at the person who handed them over. And then, without looking back, he left, silently, without a single word, leaving behind a horror that no one would want to remember. The dove remained on the table, still staring into the void. No one dared to move, because they didn't know. Now, John Kingsley was someone else, and no one knew where he would go next. John's assistant's phone rang just as he was trying to calm his nerves after what had happened at the club. He didn't want to pick up the phone, but the number was from the hospital. Yes. His voice sounded tired, broken. A cheerful voice of a nurse came through on the other end. Please tell Mr. Kingsley that his son has awakened. The assistant froze. His lips trembled, his fingers clenched the phone tighter. How? He exhaled, not believing his ears. He woke up a few minutes ago, is now conscious, condition stable. But, the assistant stammered, unable to comprehend what he had just heard. You called him 20 minutes ago and told him his son was dead. There was a pause on the other end. What? The nurse's voice darkened. Young man, don't joke about that. I just spoke with the doctor myself. And I wasn't even given Mr. Kingsley's personal number. I physically couldn't have called him. The assistant felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had set up a fake call. Someone deliberately wanted to break Kingsley. And now that someone was already dead. But John didn't know about it. At that moment, he was sitting in his son's hospital room, holding his hand, not believing his eyes. Oliver was alive. He blinked slowly, his skin was pale, his lips cracked, but his eyes were alive. Oli. John's voice broke. He couldn't speak, couldn't express what was bursting from inside. He couldn't remember the last time he cried. But now, hot moisture filled his eyes. Dad, Oliver rasped weakly, smiling. John bowed his head, covering his face with his hand, his shoulders shaking. He couldn't remember how many minutes he just sat there, gripping his son's hand, afraid that it was just a dream, that it was an illusion that would disappear as soon as he blinked. I thought I lost you. His voice was soft, broken, filled with both pain and relief at the same time. Oliver couldn't respond. He just slowly squeezed his father's fingers in response. John ran his hand over his face, pushing away the tears, then leaned over to hug his son, pressing him as tightly as he could. He heard his heartbeat. It was beating. Damn it, it was beating. I'm here. Oliver nodded, his eyes welling up with tears, but he couldn't speak for too long. At that moment, the door to the room quietly opened. Mr. Kingsley. John slowly turned around. At the threshold stood a doctor, his face tense, but there was no alarm in his voice. There's a woman outside waiting for you. John raised an eyebrow. Who? The doctor hesitated, then shrugged. She didn't introduce herself. Said you needed to talk to her. John let go of his son's hand, his eyes becoming cold as ice. Could it be Kate? Someone else? I'll be right back. He stood up slowly, his eyes once again as cold as ice. John walked into the hallway, his face showing nothing but weary determination. At the other end of the hall, by the hospital exit, stood she, Kate, in an expensive coat, perfectly styled hair, high heels, but now she looked more like a ghost than the woman who once captivated admiration. She looked battered, broken, her lips trembling, but she held herself together, arms crossed over her chest, pretending she still controlled the situation. She took a step towards him. John. But he didn't stop. He walked past her as if she were an empty spot. Kate exhaled sharply, turning to follow him. Please talk to me. John slowly turned his head, his cold eyes drying up all her attempts to appear confident. Remove her. The guards, who always followed him in the shadows, moved towards her. Kate clenched her fists, her eyes filled with panic. John, please. This is important. Today is the second birth of my son. He spoke clearly, without emotion. And I won't let you spoil this day with your presence. Kate flinched. She still tried to fight, but the guards gently, yet firmly, took her by the arms. You can't just erase me, she cried out, trying to cling to any hope. John just smirked, turned around, and walked back into the room. Kate screamed something else, but the doors had already closed, and her voice ceased to exist for him. 2 weeks later, John's office was spacious and austere, polished wood, panoramic windows overlooking the city, a desk where the fates of companies and people were decided. John calmly signed papers, uninterrupted, when the door suddenly swung open. "You ruined me." Her voice cut through the air like a broken violin. Kate burst into the office, hair disheveled, eyes red from crying, heels clacking loudly on the floor. John slowly raised his head, smiled. "No, Kate." He set aside the pen. "You ruined yourself." He stood up, his movements precise, measured, as if he were arranging chess pieces on a board. "I just removed the foundation." Kate trembled. Her lips moved in a silent attempt to object, but no voice came out. Instead, she did the unimaginable. She knelt down. "I was foolish. I made a mistake. John, give me a chance." He looked at her, as one would look at a shattered porcelain doll. Someone knocked on the door. John did not take his eyes off Kate, but his voice was even. "Come in." The door opened, and another woman entered the office. Tall, elegant, confident, in a perfectly fitting business suit. His lawyer. Kate lifted her head, and in her eyes ignited a full realization that she had just lost her last chance. John slowly approached the woman. He said nothing, just took her by the waist and leaned in, kissing her in front of Kate. It was not a long kiss, not passionate. It was affirming, like a period placed at the end of a sentence. Kate gasped. She staggered, her eyes wide in wild horror, as if she had only now seen what her life had become. You can't." Her voice broke into hysteria. She clutched her hands in her hair, tearing at it. John slowly stepped back from his new companion. He picked up an envelope from the desk and threw it in front of Kate. She flinched, looked at him, then at the envelope, and again at John. "What is this?" He smiled calmly. "A one-way ticket." He turned towards his new life, not deigning her with another glance. "Use it." Kate trembled. Her lips moved in a silent attempt to say something, but nothing came out. She no longer meant anything. The evening was quiet, but filled with an ease that had long been absent. John sat on the terrace of his new home, enjoying a cigar and fine whiskey, when Oliver stepped out onto the veranda, holding 2 cans of cola. "What, father?" Celebrating a victory. He smirked, sitting down next to him. John glanced at him, took a slow sip, and nodded. "I say I'm celebrating the end of an era of stupidity." Oliver snorted quietly, popped open a can of cola, and took a sip. "You know, Dad?" He looked at him with a sly grin. "I thought you were henpecked." John raised an eyebrow, looking at his son over his glass. "Really?" "Yeah." Oliver shrugged. "So blind, see nothing. Wife spins you around as she wants." John slowly put down his glass, crossed his arms, and gave his son a long look. "And what changed your mind, genius?" Oliver chuckled, shaking his head. "The way you turn it all around." He reached for a packet of chips, threw a couple into his mouth, and continued, now chewing. "First, you let her feel like a queen. Allowed her to think she outplayed you. Gave her freedom, money, supposedly a new life. He made a theatrical gesture with his hands. And then, when she was already celebrating her victory, you just knocked the floor out from under her." Oliver laughed, shaking his head. "Damn, Dad, you're a real strategist." John reached for a cigar, took a deep drag, and slowly exhaled the smoke. "Don't even try to outsmart me, kid." He looked at his son with a smirk. "I see your tricks with the girls a mile away." Oliver raised his hands in mock innocence. "Come on, let's skip your old school methods, okay? Times are different now." John chuckled. "Are they? Are you sure? Because some things never change." Oliver snorted and leaned back. "Like what?" John calmly looked at him and, without blinking, replied, "Women love winners." Oliver snorted, nearly choking on his cola. "Damn, Dad. Turns out you're also a philosopher." They both laughed. John looked at the night sky, feeling for the first time in a long time a true lightness. "Well, boy, I think we both deserve a new life." Oliver raised his can of cola like a glass. "To new life." John clinked his whiskey glass against it and nodded. "To new life. And this new life promised to be much better than the old one."